The staff laughed at the new nurse long before they understood why a Marine helicopter would one day land on their rooftop just for her. Long before they would watch a bleeding 4-star general grip her hand like a lifeline. Long before they would realize that the quiet woman they dismissed had once walked through fire without flinching. Because on her first night at Crestview Medical Center, Maya Rao looked like the kind of nurse nobody feared losing and nobody expected to save anyone. Important, a small figure in oversized scrubs, her shoulders slightly hunched, her voice barely rising above the hum of machines. A woman who paused before speaking as if weighing every word. A woman who flinched when doors slammed and stared too long at ceiling lights as though measuring invisible distances. And within minutes the emergency department had already decided what she was. Fragile, slow, forgettable. "Did you see her?" whispered Aaron, a second-year resident leaning against the nurse's station with casual cruelty. She triple-checked the saline bag like it was explosive. And Priya, the charge nurse, didn't even bother lowering her voice when she replied. "Great, another nervous recruit HR dumped on us." While Maya stood close enough to hear every syllable, yet far enough to pretend she hadn't, her fingers tightening around a clipboard she didn't need to hold so tightly. Her expression calm in a way that wasn't natural but learned, because Crestview's emergency ward had its own rhythm. Fast, loud, merciless, and Maya moved through it like someone who had memorized danger rather than feared it, though no one noticed the difference. When Dr. Malhotra snapped his fingers during rounds and said, "Nurse Rao, you're late with the vitals again," she nodded softly and said, "Yes, doctor," even though she had delivered the numbers minutes earlier. And when a stretcher rattled loudly down the corridor, and she stiffened for half a heartbeat before recovering, laughter followed like a reflex. "Relax," Aaron said with a grin. "It's not a battlefield." And the word battlefield lingered in the air longer than anyone intended, brushing something buried deep inside her that she'd buried again instantly. Because Maya had chosen this hospital precisely because it was supposed to be quiet. Because its emergencies were predictable, because nobody here knew her history, because anonymity felt safer than recognition, but anonymity had a cost, and she paid it every night. In silence as she cleaned blood from floors no one else wanted to touch, apologized for mistakes she hadn't made, and absorbed insults like rain against glass, while the rest of the staff built a story about her that felt convenient. She was timid, inexperienced, the kind of nurse who would freeze when things got real. Yet there were moments that didn't fit that story. The way she noticed subtle changes in breathing before monitors beeped. The way she corrected medication calculations without hesitation. The way her hands, despite their occasional tremor, never slipped when something truly mattered. But those moments were ignored because contradictions were uncomfortable, and comfort was easier than curiosity. In the break room, near midnight, laughter mixed with stale coffee while Maya sat alone at the edge of a chair, sipping tea she had brought from home because caffeine made her hands shake more than she liked. And Priya scrolled through her phone, smirking. Apparently she transferred from some military hospital overseas, she said casually, and Aaron laughed. "Yeah, and I'm a special forces surgeon." But Maya didn't react, because the rumor was close enough to truth to be dangerous, and dangerous truths were better left untouched. When the night supervisor glanced at her file and frowned at the redacted sections, he said nothing, because paperwork was easier to ignore than questions, and questions were easier to avoid than answers. Later, when a drunk driver was rushed and screaming, the ward shifted into autopilot. Interns stumbling through orders while Dr. Malhotra shouted too fast for them to follow. And without being asked, Maya stepped forward and adjusted oxygen flow with quiet precision. Her movements efficient, deliberate, almost surgical, and for a brief moment Malhotra stared at her with something close to surprise before masking it with irritation and saying, "Don't improvise." But she didn't argue, because arguing was louder than survival, and survival had taught her that loud people died first. As dawn crept through hospital windows, Crestview had already decided who Maya Rao was, and she let them, because it was easier to be underestimated than remembered. Easier to be invisible than legendary. Easier to be the nurse everyone laughed at than the person everyone expected miracles from. And as she walked down the corridor to restock supplies, her footsteps quiet, her face calm, her mind drifting not to charts or schedules, but to the distant echo of helicopter blades she hadn't heard in years. No one noticed the way she paused beneath the emergency exit sign and looked up, measuring something only she could see, because no one imagined that within days, this same hallway would be filled with shouting officers, flashing lights, and the thunder of rotors shaking the building. No one imagined that the quiet nurse they mocked would become the only person standing between life and death for a man whose name the world saluted. And no one imagined that the first time they would truly look at Maya Rao, it would already be too late to laugh. The first sound wasn't the siren but the wind, a deep, unnatural roar that made the windows of Crestview Medical Center tremble, as if the building itself sensed something catastrophic approaching. And before anyone could ask what was happening, a security guard burst through the emergency doors shouting, "Helicopter incoming, military," which made no sense because Crestview was not a military hospital and rarely saw airlifts. Yet seconds later the rooftop trembled under the thunder of rotors, and the night sky outside exploded with harsh white lights, drawing doctors, nurses, and interns toward the windows with a mix of curiosity and unease. While Maya Rao stood still at the edge of the corridor, her expression unreadable, but her body suddenly alert in a way no one had ever seen before. The elevator doors slammed open and Marines poured into the emergency ward, their boots echoing sharply against the polished floor, their faces tense, disciplined, out of place in a hospital that was used to chaos of a different kind. And between them they carried a stretcher soaked in dark red blood, a man lying motionless beneath an oxygen mask, his uniform torn, his chest rising unevenly. And when someone shouted his name, General Hale, the room froze as if time itself had hesitated, because Thomas Hale was not just another patient. He was a legend, a 4-star Marine general whose face appeared in newspapers, whose speeches filled military academies, whose survival was considered almost symbolic. And yet here he was, bleeding out on a hospital stretcher, his pulse barely registering on the monitor. The trauma team snapped into motion, Dr. Malhotra taking command with practiced authority, interns rushing for equipment, nurses calling out vitals, while Marines stood rigid along the walls like silent guardians, their presence heavy with urgency and fear. And Maya watched everything with a focus that didn't match her usual quiet demeanor, her eyes scanning the general's chest, the angle of his breathing, the pattern of blood soaking through his uniform, noticing details others missed because they were too busy reacting. Penetrating trauma to the thorax. Malhotra announced, possible shrapnel, prep for emergency surgery. But as they cut away the uniform and exposed the wound, something felt wrong. The visible injury was severe, but not catastrophic enough to explain the collapsing vitals. Yet the monitors screamed otherwise, alarms filling the room with sharp metallic cries, and the residents exchanged confused glances while Malhotra hesitated for half a second too long, a moment that could cost a life. Maya stepped forward quietly, her voice barely rising above the chaos. "Doctor, the bleeding isn't external," she said, and Malhotra didn't even look at her, snapping, "Nurse, stay in your lane," because in his mind she was still the timid recruit who trembled over saline bags. But the numbers on the monitor dropped again. The general's breathing became erratic, and panic rippled through the room as Marines tightened their fists and interns froze, unsure what to do. And in that instant Maya stopped asking for permission. She moved with sudden speed, her hands steady, her posture straight, her voice calm but commanding as she ordered a clamp, then a scalpel, then suction, surprising everyone around her, because this was not the Maya they knew. This was someone else entirely, someone who had done this before, someone who understood what the body was hiding when machines lied. Malhotra tried to interrupt, but it was too late, because Maya had already identified the real problem, a hidden internal pressure building behind the chest cavity, and with swift, precise movements she performed a procedure most of the residents had only seen in textbooks, her hands moving with brutal efficiency, cutting, releasing, decompressing, while the room held its breath. And then, slowly, the monitor changed, the heart rate stabilized, the blood pressure climbed, and the general's chest began to rise with a rhythm that sounded like survival. Silence fell over the trauma ward, broken only by the steady beep of the monitor, and every eye turned toward Maya, as if she had stepped out of a shadow into harsh light, while Malhotra stared at her not with irritation, but with disbelief. "What did you just do?" he asked quietly, and Maya wiped blood from her gloves with a composure that felt older than her years. "Temporary thoracic decompression," she replied, her voice steady. "If we waited, he wouldn't have made it." And no one argued, because the evidence was breathing in front of them. Outside the operating room, Marines whispered among themselves, their gazes no longer dismissive but curious, while nurses who had laughed at Maya earlier avoided her eyes. And Priya felt a strange knot form in her stomach as she realized that the fragile girl they had mocked had just saved one of the most powerful men in the country. Not with panic, not with hesitation, but with instincts forged somewhere, far beyond the walls of Crestview. As the general was rushed towards surgery, Malhotra walked beside Maya in silence for several steps before finally asking, almost reluctantly, "Where did you learn to do that?" And for a moment Maya hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling where the echo of helicopter blades still seemed to vibrate through the building, before she answered quietly, "Somewhere you don't get a second chance," leaving the question hanging in the air like a warning, while behind them the hospital began to understand that the story they had built about Maya Rao was crumbling, and that whatever she had been before Crestview, it was something far more dangerous, far more disciplined, and far more extraordinary than they had ever imagined. The hospital did not return to normal after that night, because normal no longer fit the story of what had happened inside its walls. And as the hours passed, and the sun climbed slowly over Crestview Medical Center, whispers followed Maya Rao through corridors that had once ignored her, voices lowered now not in mockery, but in awe, because the man lying in the ICU was not just alive, but stabilizing, his heartbeat steady, his breathing strong, his survival no longer a miracle but a fact. When General Thomas Hale finally regained consciousness, the first thing he asked was not about his condition or his command or the Marines waiting outside his door, but about the nurse who had refused to let him die. And when Maya was called into the ICU, she walked in quietly as she always had, her posture calm, her expression composed, yet the atmosphere around her felt different, heavier, charged with something that had never existed before. The general studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp despite the pain, as if he were reading a history no one else could see. And then, slowly, with effort, he pushed himself upright and extended his hand toward her, a gesture so unexpected that the room seemed to freeze. Doctors, Marines, and nurses watching in silence as Maya hesitated only briefly before stepping forward and taking it, her grip firm but gentle, and Hale's voice, rough yet steady, carried across the room with quiet authority as he said, "I've met many doctors in my life, but only a few warriors who know how to save lives when everything falls apart." His fingers tightening slightly around hers, "And you are one of them." And in that moment the laughter that had once followed Maya through the hospital seemed impossibly distant, replaced by something far heavier than respect. Understanding, Malhotra stood near the doorway, unable to meet her eyes. Priya felt her earlier words echo uncomfortably in her mind, and the interns who had once dismissed her watched with expressions they had never worn before, because they were realizing that the quiet nurse they had underestimated was not fragile, not slow, not ordinary, but someone who had chosen silence after surviving things they could not imagine. Maya did not smile, did not explain, did not defend herself. She simply nodded once, releasing the general's hand and stepping back into the quiet space she had always occupied. Yet this time it was not invisibility but choice. And as she walked down the corridor, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, no one laughed, no one whispered, and no one dared to underestimate her again, because Crestview Medical Center had learned a truth it would never forget. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who speak the least, and sometimes the nurse everyone laughed at is the reason a general, in an entire room full of proud professionals, learns what real courage looks like.